My fiance's rich dad sneered a mechanic. My son needs a woman of class. My father walked in, handed me a car key, and said, "Honey, the private jet's ready." My fiance looked between us, speechless. His dad turned red. I could feel the grease still under my fingernails, no matter how hard I'd scrubbed them before leaving the shop. It didn't matter that I had changed into a simple but elegant navy blue dress. It didn't matter that I had taken my time curling my hair or that I had picked out a pair of heels instead of my usual work boots. Because the moment Howard Lancaster III laid eyes on me, all he saw was a mechanic. The restaurant was one of those places where the chandeliers cost more than a house, the napkins felt like silk, and the waiters all looked like they had been plucked from a modeling agency. I felt out of place the second I stepped in, but I squared my shoulders and held my head high. I was here for Adrian, and that was what mattered. Howard sat at the head of the table, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. His wife, Eleanor, sat beside him, her pearl necklace perfectly matched to her earrings. She offered a polite but distant smile as Adrian pulled out a chair for me. "Well," Howard said as I settled in, his voice smooth yet cutting. "So, you're the woman my son wants to marry." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "Yes, sir," I said, keeping my tone respectful. "It's nice to meet you both." Howard didn't return the sentiment. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying me like I was a rusted-out car sitting in his pristine driveway. "A mechanic," he finally said, the word rolling off his tongue like it physically repulsed him. I didn't flinch, though my fingers instinctively curled around the napkin in my lap. "Yes, sir," I said again, this time with more confidence. Adrian reached for my hand under the table and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "Dad, don't start," he warned. Howard ignored him. "Tell me, Miss Harrington," I supplied. He nodded, though it was clear he couldn't have cared less. "Tell me, Miss Harrington," he continued, picking up his wine glass, "how exactly do you plan to contribute to this family? Or do you expect my son to carry the financial burden while you tinker with engines?" I could hear the barely concealed scoff in his voice. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "I own my own auto shop," I said evenly. "I have a steady client base, and I make a good living." Howard's lips twitched like he was holding back a laugh. "A good living?" Adrian shifted uncomfortably beside me. "Dad, I just find it amusing," Howard cut in, swirling his wine lazily, "that a woman who spends her days covered in grease believes she can keep up with my son's lifestyle." I clenched my jaw. Eleanor finally spoke. "Howard, perhaps we should what?" He interrupted, finally setting his glass down. He turned his gaze back to me. "I won't pretend to approve of this, Adrian. A woman of class and refinement is what you need. Not whatever this is." The words stung, but what hurt more was the silence that followed. Adrian didn't speak. He didn't defend me. His grip on my hand loosened slightly, and in that moment, I felt the first crack in the foundation of our relationship. I slowly pulled my hand away, sitting up straighter. If Adrian wasn't going to stand up for me, I would do it myself. "With all due respect, sir," I said, keeping my voice measured, "I may not have come for money, but I built something of my own. I don't need anyone to take care of me." Howard let out a slow, condescending chuckle. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, shaking his head. "You have no idea what world you're stepping into. My son doesn't need a charity case. He needs a woman who understands what it means to be part of high society. Someone with sophistication. Connections. Power." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the restaurant doors swung open. The sound of polished Italian leather against marble filled the room, a smooth, commanding rhythm that made heads turn. I didn't have to look up to know who it was. My father. Howard didn't react at first. He was too caught up in his own arrogance to notice the shift in the air. But Eleanor noticed. Her back straightened, and her grip on her fork tightened ever so slightly. Adrian noticed too. His fingers twitched against the tablecloth, his breath hitching just a fraction. Then Howard finally looked up. I saw it happen in real time, the realization. The slow, creeping horror as his eyes landed on my father and recognition dawned. Dad walked over to me, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek black key fob, and placed it in my palm. "The private jet's ready, honey," he said smoothly. "We should get going." I didn't say anything. I just held the key in my hand and let the silence do the work. Howard's face drained of color. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Adrian stared at me like he had never seen me before. You have a private jet?" I tilted my head. Did I forget to mention that? Howard looked between me and my father, his expression caught between disbelief and barely concealed panic. You're Samuel Harrington?" he finally croaked. Dad smiled, slipping his hands into his pockets. "That's right." Howard swallowed thickly. "The Samuel Harrington? CEO of Harrington Enterprises?" Dad nodded once. "The one and only." Howard's jaw clenched. He had spent years trying to get a meeting with my father, years trying to work his way into Dad's circle. And now, here he was, sitting across from the very man he had been desperate to impress. And he had just spent the entire evening insulting his daughter. Adrian looked at me again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You never told me." I shrugged. "You never asked." More silence. Then, Howard did what I never expected. He laughed. A short, bitter laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well," he said, picking up his wine glass and taking a long sip. "Isn't that something?" Eleanor reached for his arm, whispering something in his ear, but he barely acknowledged her. I stood up, smoothing out my dress. "I think we're done here." Adrian hesitated. "Wait." Dad placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Come on, sweetheart." I turned to Adrian one last time, searching his face for something, anything. But all I saw was uncertainty. Hesitation. A man torn between two worlds. And that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. I gave him a small, sad smile. Then, without another word, I walked away, leaving Adrian, his father, and their entire world behind. The ride to the airstrip was silent. I stared out the tinted windows of my father's car, watching the city lights blur past in streaks of gold and white. The key fob sat in my palm, its weight heavier than it should have been. Maybe because it wasn't just a key to a jet. It was a key to a life I had chosen to leave behind. Dad sat beside me, his phone in one hand, his other resting on the armrest. He was calm, unreadable as always. He had perfected that expression over decades in business. Always in control, always 3 steps ahead. But I wasn't like him. I was still trying to process what had just happened. Adrian hadn't stopped me. He had just sat there, caught between his father's expectations and whatever we had built together. And when a moment came to make a choice, he hesitated. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "You all right?" Dad finally asked, his voice smooth but laced with something softer. I swallowed hard. "Yeah." He didn't call me out on a lie. Instead, he just nodded, turning his attention back to his phone. When we arrived at the private airstrip, the jet was already waiting, engines humming softly in the night. The sleek silver fuselage gleamed under the floodlights, and the pilot stood at the base of the stairs, ready to go. I hesitated at the bottom step. I could feel my father's eyes on me, waiting. He didn't rush me, didn't push. I turned to him. "Why did you come?" He sighed, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Because I knew how this would go." I frowned. "You knew Howard was going to be an ass?" Dad let out a dry chuckle. "I knew he was going to underestimate you, and I knew you wouldn't let that slide." I looked away, my jaw tightening. Adrian didn't say anything. Dad didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied me for a moment, then said, "What did you expect him to say?" I blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I don't know. Anything." Dad exhaled through his nose. Adrian grew up in his father's world. He might love you, but tonight he realized what it means to stand up to Howard. That's not easy for someone who's been controlled their whole life. I scoffed. "So what? I'm supposed to wait around while he figures out how to grow a spine?" Dad shook his head. "No, but you have to decide if you want to be with someone who needs to be convinced to fight for you." That shut me up. I turned back to the plane, my fingers tightening around the key fob. I had worked so hard to build a life on my own terms. I had fought to prove that I didn't need my family's wealth, that I could stand on my own 2 feet. But tonight had reminded me of something else. I had spent so much time proving I didn't need anyone that I had ignored the fact that I wanted someone who wouldn't let me walk away so easily. And Adrian had let me. I took a deep breath, then climbed the steps into the jet. The cabin was luxurious but familiar. Leather seats, mahogany finishes, a stocked bar in the back. I dropped into one of the chairs, suddenly exhausted. Dad took the seat across from me, watching as I rubbed my temples. "You don't have to go back to the city tonight," he said. "We can fly to the estate. Take a few days to clear your head." I shook my head. "No, I need to figure this out." Dad leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "You already have." I sighed. A buzzing sound interrupted me. My phone. I glanced at the screen. "Adrian." My heart clenched. I hesitated before answering, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be. "Hello." For a second, all I could hear was his breathing. Then, I should have said something. His voice was strained, filled with something raw. "Guilt, maybe?" I exhaled slowly. "Yeah, you should have." A beat of silence. Then he asked, "Where are you?" I glanced at my father, who was watching me carefully, then looked down at the key fob in my lap. "About to leave," I said. Another silence. Then, "Don't go." My fingers tightened around the phone. "Why?" I asked. He hesitated. And that hesitation, it told me everything I needed to know. I closed my eyes. I wasn't the kind of person who liked playing games. I wasn't the kind of woman who begged for someone to fight for me, either. But I had loved Adrian, and a small, stupid part of me had wanted him to prove me wrong. But here he was, still hesitating. still weighing his options, still caught between me and his father. And I was tired of waiting. I exhaled slowly, gripping the phone a little tighter. I don't think you understand, Adrian. I'm going. His breath hitched on the other end. But we need to talk, do we? I cut him off. Because, if I remember correctly, I sat at that table tonight and listened to your father treat me like I was dirt under his shoe. And you just sat there. You didn't defend me. You didn't say a word until it was too late. He was silent. I let the words settle between us before I spoke again, softer this time. You say you love me. But love isn't just words, Adrian. It's action. And when it mattered, you froze. I didn't freeze, he said, voice raw. I was shocked. My father has controlled everything my entire life. It's not that simple for me. I sighed. I know it's not simple, but it was a choice. A long pause. Then, almost desperate, he whispered, and if I choose you now? I closed my eyes, feeling my heart squeeze one last time. It's too late. I heard his sharp inhale, like he had expected it, but still wasn't prepared to hear it. You could have fought for me at that table, I said. You didn't. A painful silence stretched between us. Finally, he exhaled shakily. I do love you, he said, voice quiet. I smiled sadly. I know. And then I hung up. I set the phone on the armrest, my fingers trembling slightly. My father watched me, his expression unreadable. You okay? He finally asked. I nodded, even though my throat felt tight. Yeah. Dad leaned back, exhaling through his nose. I knew he wasn't the one for you. I let out a dry chuckle. Yeah? And when were you planning to tell me that? He smirked. Not my lesson to teach. I shook my head, smiling despite myself. The engines hummed louder as the pilot prepared for takeoff. I leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes. The weight in my chest was still there, but something else settled in too. Relief. I had spent too much time proving I could stand on my own. Now, I finally understood that the right person wouldn't have needed proof. And Adrian? He wasn't the right person. 1 year later, the sun gleamed off the polished hood of the newest car in my garage, a sleek, custom-built luxury model from my own design. My business had expanded in the past year, growing into something bigger than I ever imagined. What started as a small auto shop was now a full-fledged high-performance engineering company. And the best part? I did it on my own. Yes, I had my father's last name, but I had built my business from the ground up without a cent of his money. And when investors finally took notice, it wasn't because of my connections. It was because my work was damn good. I wiped my hands on a rag, stepping back to admire the car. Not bad, a familiar voice said behind me. I turned and grinned. You say that like you're surprised. Damon Archer, my lead engineer and one of my closest friends, chuckled. Not surprised, just impressed. I nudged him with my elbow. That's more like it. Just then, the sound of expensive tires crunching on gravel caught my attention. A sleek black luxury sedan pulled up to the garage. And stepping out? Howard Lancaster III. I raised an eyebrow, sharing a glance with Damon. Well, I murmured. Howard adjusted his suit jacket as he walked toward me, his expression carefully neutral. But I saw it. The tension in his jaw, the slight furrow in his brow. He was uncomfortable. Good. Miss Harrington, he greeted stiffly. I crossed my arms. Mr. Lancaster. His gaze flicked around the garage, taking in the pristine workspace, the high-tech equipment, the team of engineers working on state-of-the-art engines. He didn't comment on it, but I could tell he was impressed. Finally, he cleared his throat. I hear you've made quite a name for yourself. I smiled. So they tell me. Howard hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. I wanted to discuss a potential partnership. I almost laughed out loud. A year ago, he had looked down on me, sneered at my profession, dismissed me as unworthy of his son. And now he needed me. I tilted my head, letting the silence stretch between us just long enough to watch him sweat. Then I said, funny. I thought a woman of class and refinement was what you needed. Howard's jaw tightened. Damon snorted beside me, clearly enjoying this as much as I was. Howard inhaled sharply, then forced a tight smile. I may have misjudged you. I let his words hang in the air. Then, slowly, I stepped forward, standing just a little too close. Not enough to be threatening, but enough to remind him that I had the upper hand now. You didn't misjudge me, Mr. Lancaster, I said, voice smooth. You underestimated me. His lips pressed into a thin line. I leaned in just a fraction. And I don't do business with people who underestimate me. Then, without another word, I turned on my heel and walked away. Damon let out a low whistle as we watched Howard stiffly get back into his car. Damn, he muttered. That was beautiful. I smirked, wiping my hands on my rag. It was beautiful. Revenge didn't have to be Krell. It didn't have to be loud. Sometimes the best revenge was success. And as Howard Lancaster III drove away, his pride bruised, his offer rejected, his ego shattered, I knew that I had won. Howard Lancaster 3 drove away, his sleek black luxury sedan disappearing down the long stretch of road, leading away from my garage. I watched until the taillights faded, then let out a slow breath. Damon turned to me, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. That was the most satisfying thing I've ever seen. I chuckled, tossing my grease-streaked rag onto the workbench. Felt pretty damn good. You think he'll try again? I shrugged. Maybe, but it won't matter. Howard Lancaster had built his world on control, power, and looking down on people he deemed unworthy. And now, the same woman he had sneered at, a mechanic, had the power to turn him down. And that was enough for me. The old me, the one who had sat at that dinner table waiting for Adrian to defend me, waiting to be chosen, might have still cared, might have still wondered what could have been. But now I didn't just know my worth. I lived it. As if on cue, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, glancing at the name on the screen. Adrian. I stared at it for a second. Then, without hesitation, I hit decline. Damon let out a low whistle. Cold. I grinned. Nah, just moving forward. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, turned on my heel, and walked back toward my garage, toward the life I had built. No regrets. No looking back. Just me, my business, and a future that no one, not Adrian, not his father, not anyone, could take away from me. And damn, that felt good.